8 or 16 gigs of unified memory. Which option would be better for your new M2 MacBook Air? And it may seem obvious, but it's not all that simple. There is one extremely important factor ignoring which you might end up wasting your money and reducing the lifetime of your brand new M2 MacBook. So, which model should you go with? Let's get into it and figure it out. So, we made a bunch of videos about the previous M1 Air, and it almost seemed like nothing much should change with the transition to the new M2 model, but how wrong is that? It turned out that due to the issues with the NAND chips, we came up with recommendations for choosing the M2 Air configuration that suits you. And I promise there will be performance test results in the video, so just be patient. Unfortunately, not many creators mention a point that can end up being a huge problem for you. I'm talking about the swap memory, sometimes referred to as virtual memory. To provide you with better context, when your MacBook needs more RAM, it puts what isn't currently in use into the swap file for temporary storage. When access to those files is required again, it will read the data from the swap file and put it back into RAM. Now let me tell you how this works. RAM on a MacBook has access to the main drive where it can take up space. Given the speed of the new SSDs, this happens fast and usually we don't even notice it. RAM works even faster, but it doesn't store files since it's needed for work in active mode or work happening in real time. That is, you are not able to save your files to RAM. Now imagine that RAM is a whiteboard and you're writing on it with a marker. Your notes stay on the board as long as you need them to, but as soon as you are no longer using the board or aren't in immediate need of your notes, you erase them. So does the RAM. When you close an app, its working files are erased and the RAM is prepared to make new notes. In essence, after we erase the board, we get a clean slate. Now think of the SSD as writing on a piece of paper with a pencil. A pencil, of course, can be erased with an eraser, but if you use the eraser over and over again, sooner or later it will ruin the paper. And consequently, writing on that piece of paper will get much more difficult. This is exactly how modern SSD drives work. Their resources are limited, and after you deplete them, the drive will start to work slower. But how are RAM and SSD connected? It may not seem so obvious to you, but the connection is pretty intense, and the choice of RAM size will directly affect how long your MacBook will work at its maximum speed. The constant writing and erasing of data files harms the SSD over time, although it usually takes years. When you open too many apps or perform a resource-intensive task, your RAM gets swamped, but your Mac will still run efficiently. However, it will still fill up the swap files stored on your SSD as a temporary storage space for data that didn't fit onto RAM. This means that data and files are constantly being recorded and erased from your SSD when the RAM can no longer host new data. So what is so special about it that it turns into a big problem? Well, for 95% of all MacBook users, this is not scary because in regular use, you will most likely never use up a significant amount of memory with the swap file. And even if you do, it takes an extremely large amount of workload for there to be any severe consequences for a noticeable negative impact on the SSD. So there is really nothing to worry about unless, of course, you are an experienced user who needs to edit, render, and multitask a lot. In that case, you definitely should not take models under 16 gigabytes because heavy workloads create heavy swap files, which over time drops the performance of your SSD. On top of that, heavy workloads lead to a messy Mac, a bunch of files on it, a bunch of new problems, and one of the best ways to solve Mac problems is Setup, which is the sponsor of today's video. One of the things that Setup can be good for is solving hardware problems. For example, iStat menus. It's extremely useful if you want to monitor exactly what your Mac is doing. For example, the CPU, GPU, SSD, and RAM usage. So if your computer is slowing down, this will help you understand what's going on and eventually solve these problems. A simple app that solves a speed problem is called Quit All. It allows you to speed up your Mac by quitting background apps, but you don't lose any changes when doing so. You can quit all apps at once from the menu bar and force quit and reopen apps that are stuck. Very simple and lightweight, but it surprises me how often I use this. Or Al Dente Pro allows me to set my battery charging limits and prolong my battery's lifespan. One of the most important problems to solve on your Mac. There are many more applications for only $9.99 for a monthly subscription, so basically setup is filling the macOS and iOS gaps in certain contexts, and it provides good alternatives to default apps. I think it's an essential toolbox for macOS and iOS, and to learn more about setup, check out the link in the description below. And here, please pay extra attention to the 256GB model. If you watched my last video, you surely already know that the MacBook with the M2 chip has an issue with the NAND chip in both the Pro version and the latest Air. In the base model, where the SSD is 256GB, there's only one NAND chip, while before there were two. At 512GB, there are two NAND chips, which positively affects the speed of the SSD. The one NAND chip in the base M2 Air really makes a difference, especially on its performance speed if it has only 8GB of unified memory. Just so you understand the difference, here are the file transfer tests for you. 256 versus 512GB SSD. Do you still think that one NAND chip is not such a big deal? MacBook 250 should disappear from the face of the earth. But what does this have to do with Mac's performance and RAM? Look, when the RAM runs out, the MacBook starts to interact with the swap memory so that the laptop continues to operate efficiently. That is, 8 gigs of unified memory does not necessarily mean that it's your limit. Often thanks to swap, this limit is increased to 10 to 12GB, and it works flawlessly on the M1 models. However, on the base model of the M2, the speed of the SSD is considerably lower. And these are not just numbers in benchmarks, it really takes longer to drop files. And if the MacBook also accesses the swap memory, then the laptop slows down more apparently than it would with the M1. Okay, so what's the way out of this situation? Unfortunately, one way is not to get a Mac with a 256GB SSD, and most interestingly, Apple is not to blame for this oversight. The market has stopped producing 128GB NAND chips, and most likely because of this, the future M1 Macs will eventually have the faulty SSD at the base 256GB model, affecting their performance. So what? We shouldn't buy the base M2 model with 256 and 8GB of memory? Exactly, don't buy it. Because you will encounter noticeable speed drops both in multitasking and in general when working with that system. There is a much better option, the 8 unified memory and 512 SSD. But only if you don't perform any resource-intensive tasks for which RAM will take resources from the SSD. If you perform heavy tasks on this model every day for long periods of use, you will experience a reduction of your SSD performance faster than with regular use. Here is a comparison and a variety of tests of 8GB unified memory versus 16, but with 512 SSD. I can once again tell you what a huge difference this is, but I think you can see it for yourself. There is just one thing I don't understand. Why the hell did Apple launch a model so different from the other? No, seriously, there is such a huge gap between two models that have mostly the same specs. Apple, why don't we call the base model Air and everything above that Pro? Tell me in the comments if you think my idea makes more sense than the way Apple lays out their marketing for this Mac. And this is a serious problem because the SSD is non-removable. Therefore, my advice is, if you have the money, take the 16GB model. If you're confident enough that you won't be rendering every day and opening 30 apps at the same time, you can try the 8GB option, but never with a 256GB SSD. Unfortunately, it looks like Apple's game plan here is just to fish out money from the consumer using this model as a bait. Sadly, you won't get the expected quality and great value for $11.99. Do you know why Apple was so proud that the M1 MacBook Air was the #1 laptop in the world in terms of sales? Because even its base model delivered such an impressively high performance and energy efficiency that it was extremely difficult for competitors from Windows laptops to compete. And even then, all that competitors could offer was the age-old argument about Mac's inability to host video games. But I want to believe that this is just a temporary oversight to be corrected over time in their future devices, and in the meantime, smash the like button if you like this video. Also, go ahead and click on this one and see you in the next one.